Now, good morning to everyone in the room. Our focus today and tomorrow is on social and ethical factors that could or should be taken into account by governments considering implementing lockdowns and restrictions. I'd like to welcome our expert witnesses and thank them all for agreeing to participate in what I am sure will be a very interesting and lively discussion. I'll now invite Inquiry Senior Counsel Stuart Gale KC to introduce the experts and make an opening statement, in the course of which he will set out the timings for the submission of any Rule 9 requests that arise over the course of today and tomorrow. I would ask all legal representatives to take note of the timings and to adhere to them. Thank you. Now, Mr. Gale.
Thank you, my Lord. And I join your Lordship in thanking our experts who have given up their time and knowledge to assist us in this inquiry. In preparation for these hearings, our experts were asked to provide their views under reference to a number of questions. They were each asked in advance to comment on the terms of the questions, and the questions were eventually settled after comments from them. We appreciate, given the respective areas of expertise, that some topics we would like to discuss will fit more naturally within one expert's area of expertise than necessarily with others. But because of the inevitable overlap between the various topics, we will be interested to hear and learn the views of all as informed observers. As everyone will have observed, the inquiry has secured for this session a number of distinguished experts. These are as follows. Professor James Wilson is the Professor of Philosophy at University College London, where he specialises in ethical and philosophical issues posed by public health interventions. Among his published work is a book, Philosophy for Public Health and Public Policy Beyond the Neglectful State, published in 2021, which, as he puts it, provides a syntopic theory of how states should protect and promote the health of their citizens. He was a member of the Ethics Advisory Board for the NHS COVID-19 app in 2020, and from 2020 to 2022 he participated as a co-investigator on the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded UK Pandemic Ethics Accelerator, which brought together researchers from across the UK to provide ethics advice for policymakers. Professor Nicole Busby is the Professor of Human Rights, Equality and Justice at the University of Glasgow. She has over 30 years' experience as a legal academic. She has served as a member of the Equality and Human Rights Commission's Scotland Committee. She has been a member of the First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership and is currently a member of the Scottish Government's Human Rights Incorporation and Implementation Oversight Board. Lord Jonathan Sumption was a practicing barrister between 1977 and 2011. He was a Justice of the UK Supreme Court from 2012 to 2018, during which time he sat on some of the most significant cases involving consideration of human rights issues, and he was one of the justices on the court in the prorogation case Miller No. 2. He has written on the issues presented by lockdown as a response to the COVID pandemic in his books Law in a Time of Crisis and The Challenges of Democracy. In his other capacity as a historian, he is also the author of a 5-volume history of the 100 Years' War. Professor Michael Parker is the Professor of Bioethics and Director of the Ethox Centre at the University of Oxford. His special areas of expertise are in the ethical aspects of global health, infectious diseases, genomics, and data science. Together with partners in Africa and Southeast Asia, he established in 2010 the Global Health Bioethics Network. In 2020, he established with the Berman Institute at Johns Hopkins University, the Oxford Johns Hopkins Global Infectious Disease, the Global Health Bioethics Network. In relation to the Johns Hopkins University, he established the Oxford Johns Hopkins Global Infectious Disease Ethics Collaborative. These two collaborations are widely regarded as the leading international research networks in global health bioethics. He was the ethics advisor on the core SAGE group between April 2020 and February 2022. Professor Paul Kearney is the Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the University of Stirling, where he researches into UK and Scottish government policy processes. In 2023, he was a special advisor to the Scottish Parliament Finance and Public Administration Committee inquiry into effective Scottish government decision-making. He was an expert witness to the UK COVID-19 inquiry in Module 2A on core UK decision-making and political governance, Scotland. Professor David Miles, CBE, is the Professor of Financial Economics at Imperial College London. He was a member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England between 2009 and 2015. Prior to that, he was the chief UK economist at Morgan Stanley from 2004 to 2009. He specializes in the interaction between financial markets and the wider economy. Last year, he was appointed as a member of the Office for Budget Responsibility and of the Budget Responsibility Committee of the OBR. Each expert has provided a slightly fuller but brief biography in their responses to the posed questions. In instructing our experts, the inquiry made clear that critical to the requests is that the experts should consider what knowledge could and should have been available to decision makers and what considerations could and should have been applied before making decisions such as lockdown and indeed other NPIs. As everyone will appreciate, this is not an exercise in marking the cards of either the Scottish government or the UK government, or indeed any other government, in connection with the response to the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. What we wish to hear are views on what information and factors could and should a government decision maker have had regard to in arriving at a decision to lock down or to impose any other form of MPI. And all that in the context and in response to a public health emergency. It would, however, be naive to remove from our discussion events which occurred or didn't occur in the context of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, where those involved the actings or omissions of governments and where they inform our panelists' comments. This inquiry is charged with, inter alia, inquiring into the strategic decision-making of the Scottish government during the pandemic, producing a record of that and making recommendations to the Scottish ministers based upon that analysis. These hearings that we have conducted over the past 10 days and will continue today and tomorrow have, and hopefully will, assist in providing us with a context in which to interrogate the decision-making process associated with the response to the pandemic and the implementation of those decisions, and indeed, and importantly, to make recommendations. These hearings involve consideration of some of the very difficult questions which this inquiry has to grapple with, and it would be wrong of this inquiry to avoid them. We have received, over the past few days, a number of informal Rule 9 questions, which can be put to the panel as a whole, and also questions for individual members of our panel. I record my gratitude to those core participants and their advisors for those submitted questions, and also record my gratitude to the members of the inquiry legal team who have considered the questions and who have advised on their admissibility. And also to my learned junior, Ms. Barami, who's on my left, who was tasked with the final assessment of those questions. As indicated by His Lordship, if core participants have further questions arising out of our evidence sessions today and which are novel, and both today and tomorrow, these can be submitted in accordance with our procedure, and we would ask that they are submitted to us by 12:30 tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon indeed. With that, my Lord, those are the opening remarks I'd like to make at this stage.
Very good. We'll proceed to the evidence then, please.
We can, my Lord. Good morning to you all. Again, from the legal team and in the inquiry, our thanks to you, each of you, for giving up your time and joining us here today. I'd like to begin, if I may, by going slightly before the questions that we have posed for you, to look at the context of a decision to lock down. And we obviously have the recent example of the SARS-CoV lockdown, so as to inform consideration of non-pharmaceutical interventions, which would include lockdown. And using SARS-CoV-2 as the example, I'd like to pose to you the question of what information in the early days of dealing with such a pandemic would you wish decision makers to have access to concerning the nature of the source of the infection or the virus, and assuming that assuming that type of health emergency, whether you would consider it necessary to understanding its potential for widespread infection and the means by which it is thought to be transmitted. And can I put that first to Professor Parker?
Thank you very much. Thank you, my Lord, and the inquiry for inviting me to be here today. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to say a few words. One thing I forgot to mention in my biography, which I think is relevant to the things I'll say, is that before I became an academic, for 10 years I ran a hostel for homeless teenagers in London, and I think having that experience actually made a big difference during the COVID pandemic. I didn't write, that's not the fault of, I didn't write that down. I think it seems, firstly, I think it will be, I'm not a scientist, so I should say that. There are a number of reasons why it might be important to know something about the source of an outbreak or a pandemic, but that will often be very difficult, I think. So, sometimes we'll have, if global surveillance systems work well, we may have a fair amount of advance warning. There may be an outbreak of a pathogen with pandemic potential in some other part of the world, and it may well be possible to say something about where that's come from. In other cases, we won't know, as perhaps we didn't at the beginning of this pandemic. We knew roughly where in the world where it came from, but we didn't know the source. And in the end, we perhaps still don't know the source. But I think there are a number of reasons why we might want to know that, and that information might be valuable if we were able to have access to it. So the first might be that might have implications for the nature of the threat. arranged, and so it's something about the origin of the virus and its source may tell us something about how we should prepare or respond. So there are sort of scientific, clinical, and policy implications there. I think it may well also, in the longer term, have implications for questions of responsibility and accountability. Where did this come about? Were appropriate safeguards in place, protections, etc. And then, thirdly, hopefully for future learning. What can we do in the future that might enable an outbreak of this type either not to happen or to be managed at source in ways that prevent the pandemic? So I suppose those would be. I think that information may well be valuable for those kinds of reasons, but the facts of the matter will depend hugely on the nature of the pathogen and the world that we find ourselves living in at that time.
Perhaps just taking that further with you, Professor Parker, but for consideration by all members of the panel. Inherent, I think, in what you're saying is that in the early days there is the element of uncertainty. So far as the scientific knowledge is concerned. So far as decision makers are concerned, does that make, I don't know if this is a rhetorical question, but does that make difficulties for them in taking initial steps in relation to guarding against the pathogen that is either coming or has come?
I mean, the first question you asked was really primarily about the nature of the source, and I think
yes.
that's but it seems the COVID experience shows us, but in society and in any kind of threat more broadly, uncertainty, open-endedness, and imperfect knowledge are going to be inevitable features, really, to different degrees in any kind of situation like this. So I think policymakers, health systems, and ethicists need to find ways of doing their jobs in ways that are thoughtful, responsible, accountable, in the face of and taking full account of the uncertainties that they find themselves facing. That's not an excuse for saying that we shouldn't do our best to understand, of course, that we don't. Uncertainty shouldn't just be accepted, but it's an inevitable feature, I think, of these kinds of situations.
Thank you. Professor Wilson, can I ask you for your views on the generality of the question that I first asked about uncertainty in particular?
Yeah, I think that governments are in a very difficult position in responding to a threat which is of a very uncertain nature. So I think it might be helpful to unpick some parts of the uncertainty that a government will face, so that what it was like for a government, say, in February 2020, where the degree of uncertainty about, well, what's the case fatality rate? We didn't really have enough data to get a sort of a baseline. Think, well, if this were to rip through a population, how many people would die? Then there's another question about how infectious the disease is, how rapidly a case is doubling over time. There's also a degree of uncertainty about what the mechanism of transmission is. And without any degree of certainty about all these matters, it's quite difficult to know what a proportionate response to that would be. And the one thing that's become apparent in the UK response is that initial data suggested that the case rates were doubling more slowly than they in fact were doubling. And given the nature of exponential growth, if you think that cases are doubling, for example, every 5 to 7 days, and it turns out they're doubling every 3 days, then what you initially thought you had, say, a month to think about will have to be decided within 1 to 2 weeks.
Thank you. Just following on from that, and we will come to matters related to that answer in due course. But one of the issues I think that we are concerned with is the appropriate level of preparedness so far as governments are concerned. And this brings us to the subject of pre-pandemic planning. Now, so far as pre-pandemic planning is concerned, and we will, as I say, we will come to this, but just initially, what are your views on the extent to which preparations should be in place for something like the SARS-CoV pandemic. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that epidemiologists have been talking about for a long time. People have been talking about the big one when it was going to come. People had initially assumed it was most likely to be pandemic flu, but the idea that the world was overdue for a pandemic of this kind of scale, that was was common knowledge. I myself first taught on the ethics of pandemics to my students in 2010 at that point, and we were sort of thinking that it was imminent. We looked at various sort of questions about the ability that the world had to manufacture the number of vaccines that were required, and it made quite depressing reading, and that governments had known that this was likely. There'd been some sort of pandemic preparation exercises, but that you might sort of think about what preparation requires. Do you have the right amount of medical personnel, the beds, the PPE, everything else that would be required for any sort of plausible pandemic response? So I think that, yes, the evidence that such a response might be needed was there.
Yes, thank you. We'll come, as we go through some of the other questions, to what that, in your views, the pre-pandemic planning should have planned for, and the particular expertise and information that would have been required for that. Can I ask our other panelists to give us any views they have on the situation of a government faced with something like SARS-CoV-2 and the ability to make decisions in a very quickly changing environment? Professor Busby, do you have a view on that?
Yes, thank you very much. I do have a view on that. I mean, I think it's really difficult to be taking action, making decisions in real time, because for the reasons that we've heard, the degree of uncertainty makes it almost impossible to predict what's going to happen. And I think that brings all sorts of challenges for government. And so I think preparedness is the key, and I'll come back to that, I think, probably in later questions. But we do have information, and we did have information before the pandemic hit about particular vulnerable groups, the ways that people live, the access to resource that people have, the differences in that. And I think that information could have and should next time, and there presumably will be a next time, make us better prepared as a society and enhance government decision-making on how to act and what actions to take. So I think it is about thoughtful policy-making and learning from the past, but using the information that we should have, and where we don't have that information, making sure that we find ways of getting that information, having access to that information, to do with things like resources, to do with risk assessments and the sorts of actions that should be taken when we find ourselves in this type of health emergency. But I think probably I'm straying into the realms of later questions.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Lord Sumption, can I have your view, if I may, on the question of uncertainty as a factor in the initial stages of dealing with a pandemic and responding to it by a particular form of non-pharmaceutical intervention?
Well, the categories of information which one would like to have are, I think, clear. Transmissibility of the pathogen, the mechanism of transmission, the mortality rate, and the morbidity rate. Secondly, one needs to have some idea of the degree of vulnerability of different categories of potential victim and the extent to which different categories may be differentially exposed to the pathogen. For example, in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 to 22, the categories most at risk were relatively young and fit people in the sort of 25 to 50 year bracket, quite different, therefore, from COVID-19, that would inform a completely different set of measures to deal with them. Thirdly, I think that one needs a clear grasp of the economic and societal implications of various measures that might be taken to deal with different kinds of pathogen. And that really brings one to the fourth and critical point, which has been mentioned by Professor Busby, the importance of preparation. Clearly, you can't prepare for every aspect of a pathogen which is as yet unknown. But it is possible to review the considerations that affect different possibilities. An attempt was in fact made to do this in the aftermath of the earlier pandemic, which in the end didn't hit Europe in 2005, both at UK level with the introduction of pandemic planning on a much more deliberate scale, and also at European level with the creation of the Centre for European Disease Control. In fact, we had less information than we would have liked, but still a very great deal of information at quite an early stage. The scientific formula for the pathogen was known at an early stage from China. The differential impact on different groups was known at a fairly early stage from Italy. There had been very elaborate plans. They were incomplete. They didn't cover every possible measure that might be taken, but they were by and large disregarded, certainly in England, throughout, which is, I think, unfortunate, because although they had some defects, they were nevertheless extremely helpful in many ways.
Thank you. Professor Miles, you come to this issue from the perspective of an economist, and this is perhaps overlapping slightly with issues that we're going to go on to. But from your perspective, and in the very early days of reacting to or planning for and reacting to a pandemic of the type that we are we know we experienced in March, or before March, 2020. What difficulties so far as the general uncertainty around the nature and extent and potential effects of the pandemic does that pose for the economist who is maybe advising governments on non-pharmaceutical interventions?
Well, the factors about which there are uncertainty have been clearly mentioned by others. The speed of the spread of the virus, the way in which it's transmitted, the risks to different groups in society. One might add the likelihood that precautionary measures taken by people voluntarily in the light of public health advice, there's uncertainty about all those things. I think one implication of that is that in the early days, as one is learning much more about all of those things, there may be a case for imposing restrictive measures which, if kept in place for a substantial period of time, many, many weeks and months, would be extraordinarily costly, but might be warranted in a period when you're learning a lot quite quickly about some of those factors, which would then inform whether or not it made sense to adopt certain policies which might be much less restrictive. I very much agree with what Lord Sumption said, which is that one needs to be mindful of the wider costs of certain measures, particularly of the most restrictive measures like lockdowns, where I think it was clear relatively early on that those costs were going to be very, very large if the most restrictive measures were kept in place for a substantial period of time. There are costs on the mental health and well-being of people who are isolating. the sort of lost livelihoods, the economic costs, the cost to the government of trying to offset the lost livelihood costs, the build-up of and the postponement of scans and medical procedures. I think that was relatively predictable, that if you kept in place the most restrictive measures for a long period of time, those costs would build up and become extraordinarily large, as I think they have been. And I think all that meant that during a period when we were learning a great deal more about many of the factors about the spread, the disease, how it was spreaded, what offsetting actions voluntarily taken by people might affect the spread, and the risks to different groups. As there was more information about those things, I think it should have fed into a broad analysis of costs and benefits of different measures, which, when it came to lockdown, I think did not happen. In other words, insufficient attention was paid to the very steeply rising costs of the most restrictive measures relative to the benefits.
We'll come, thank you, Professor, we'll come to perhaps looking at possible reasons why that wasn't pursued. But just initially, and as I say, we'll come to this in a little more detail. In that context, as you're describing, particularly the economic cost, is there a concern, so far as policymakers are concerned, that they may have to ask and answer very unpalatable questions in the sense of balancing the cost of preserving life against the cost of the economic damage which restrictions may cause?
I mean, they are difficult questions. I think they're questions that governments face all the time, in particular within the health service, as to whether certain very expensive treatments which might prolong the life of someone who's got multiple illnesses and is relatively old versus another treatment which might affect the life quality of a larger group of relatively young people. So those trade-offs occur all the time. I mean, they occur at slightly more trivial levels, perhaps, in deciding what should national speed limits be on motorways. If one decided that one wished to reduce very dramatically the number of deaths on the road, one could do that. One could do that by reducing the speed that people could drive on motorways to 25 miles an hour. So those choices, which I think are sometimes misleadingly described as, oh, it's money versus lives. I think that is an extremely misleading way of thinking about the question. You weren't suggesting that. I think those questions arise in a huge range of public policy issues.
Okay. Professor Kearney, could I ask you, bearing in mind your experience, both in terms of research and practical context, you are aware of decision-making processes that governments require to carry out. Can we confine ourselves just initially to decision-making processes in a rapidly developing and urgent situation? Now, can you give us some comments from your perspective of what governments could and should be doing in that situation?
Yes. So I think in that context, there's a distinction between the models of policymaking that governments would like to adopt and what they're actually able to adopt. So the classic reference point there is this idea of a policy cycle that as soon as they are aware of a problem, they have a series of stages to which they go through to turn it into action. So that would start with defining the problem. In this case, I mean, Actually, in this case, it might seem obvious that the definition of the problem is there's an epidemic or a pandemic coming, but I don't think that would be the initial definition they would be dealing with. It would be more it'd be more like, you know, how do I make sense of this information? Why should I pay attention to this issue more than all the other issues I have to pay attention to? And how does any of this information relate to action? And I think that's a useful distinction to remember in terms of our focus is often on the communication of information to policymakers, so that creates certain focus on scientists about how best can I convey this information while recognising uncertainty. And there's a lot of focus in science on how to communicate uncertainty with reference to probability, but also percentages or colours. You know, in terms of how can I convey levels of uncertainty when I don't know what my audience understands in terms of uncertainty. You know, if you say this is likely, it's very difficult to know what you and they would mean by that. Or if you give it, I mean, red lights and green lights are often better. So that's different from how policymakers might experience uncertainty, because they're essentially looking to ignore as much information as possible so they can make choices. I think that's I know that's a conceptual distinction, but I think a lot of science is about filling gaps, generating more and more information to reduce uncertainty. Policymaking is about minimizing the information to which you pay attention, because otherwise it would be overwhelming. So essentially I would be thinking the key aspect here is not only what information people have, but how can they get policymakers to pay attention to this information above all other things? And I think that would come down to, you know, at what point would there be a tipping point to action?
Okay. Just again, anticipating where we may be going in this discussion, you've talked about the conveying of information from scientists, as it would be here, epidemiologists, to politicians, maybe filtered through civil servants. Can I ask you whether you, and we will come to this, but can I ask you whether there is a difficulty in getting that information across to politicians at early stages?
Yes. So you can watch this difficulty unfold if you read the minutes of SAGE. Okay, now I have to spell out Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies. Yeah. Right, excellent.
Okay. Well done.
So you can see from their early reports and reports of other bodies that first they're talking to each other and expressing their own uncertainty about what is about to happen. So the first report talks about there has been a case identified in China. We do not know yet if it will travel outside of China. There is, in the first report, I think there's a focus on we don't know if this is human-to-human transmission. And in subsequent reports, we don't know the fatality rate if this is spread. And it keeps building at levels of certainty drop over time, you know, from January to February to March. But I think that's the thing that science advisors would be trying to work out. How do I convey this information to policymakers at a point where I think they should pay more attention? You know, because there's routine delivery of information to keep them aware of things, but also they need to convey it in a more, to convey a greater sense of urgency when they have higher priorities. So I know, for example, a lot of this science was being conveyed during discussions on Brexit, for example. So the question would be, why does this matter more than Brexit or some other salient issue?
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your observations on that. In the course of answering those questions, certainly Professor Busby and Lord Sumption have both mentioned the need to identify those in society who are the most vulnerable to adverse consequences should they become infected. Again, looking at this in the context of early interventions or advising on early interventions, that, it seems to me, requires there to be a bank of knowledge that is available to a government on which it can rely. Is there, in your respective views, any difficulty, or should there be any difficulty in having that bank of knowledge available? We'll go around as we are. Professor Parker, do you feel that
Thank you very much.
That's a difficulty?
I think there are some difficulties. So clearly work needs to be done as part of preparedness. I think it's very important. There'll be vulnerabilities in terms of there'll be medical vulnerabilities, which will to some extent depend upon the nature of the virus. I mean, Lord Sumption mentioned the pandemic in 1918, but of course we've recently seen Zika as well, which affected pregnant women and their children. So there are a range of ways in which an infection might be dangerous, and that would have impacts on it. That will impact who's vulnerable medically, and those are important things to take into account. But of course, it's really important to think about vulnerability in a more holistic way than that, as we've heard. So there are a number of ways in which people could be vulnerable as a result of their poverty or their particular social circumstances. Their employment might be precarious in various ways. So vulnerabilities here are going to be of a range of different kinds, and some of these will be things that we can predict in advance. They'll be to do with the nature of our society, and some of them will be apparent. Some of them will be to do with the resilience of the health system and other services. Some of them will be to do with things like the kinds of decisions we make. So, for example, if we don't compensate people or protect, for example, their employment or their housing status when we require them to do tests, which might mean they need to stay at home and not earn a living, that creates a vulnerability. So not all vulnerabilities are there in advance, as it were. Some of them depend on the kind of decisions that we make, and I think that's incredibly important. And I think, decisions that could have been made differently. For example, I think vulnerabilities like the potential for domestic abuse, for children who are in dangerous situations of one kind or another, or vulnerable. These are things that we could be aware of and might need to take into our decision making. So, for example, personally, I think many social workers should have been allowed to go about their business during the pandemic in ways that they weren't able to. I think young people and potentially women and other groups were made vulnerable as a result. So some of those vulnerabilities are pre-existing. Some of them will societally. Some of them will be dependent on the nature of the disease, as it were. And some of them will be created by the decisions we make. And only so many of those can be known about in advance. So there's work that can be done in terms of preparation, but inevitably that's going to need to be sufficiently flexible so that we don't end up preparing for fighting the previous war, as it were. Not all future pandemics are going to be COVID-19.
Yes. I think that's, again, an important point to remember, and it's a point that several of you have mentioned, that the next pandemic, which we assume will happen at some point, may not affect particular cohorts of society in the same way that the COVID pandemic, and put in very simple terms, the COVID pandemic did, and presumably at the outset had the potential to affect principally the elderly in society. The next pandemic may obviously affect children far more than the pandemic we've just gone through did. Again, the bank of knowledge that is available, one would assume, would have to be very wide to enable that to have the flexibility to meet the changing circumstances of a new pandemic.
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention, but I think is important, is that some vulnerabilities might be created by the groups that the pandemic affects in other ways. So, for example, as we've seen through monkeypox, for example, or the HIV pandemic, there are ways in which depending on the groups that are affected by the disease. Yes. If those are already stigmatized groups, then that also can make a huge difference.
Yeah. And to you, Professor Parker, I should give an apology. You did tell me of your involvement with a homeless organisation, and I'm afraid I forgot to mention it, so my apologies. Professor Wilson, can I come to you on the identification of vulnerable sectors in society? Do you have any particular view on that?
I would agree with everything that Professor Parker just said. That, I mean, one thing that really struck me reflecting on my own experiences and the advice I was asked to give during the pandemic is that there's one thing is knowing at a general level which groups are most vulnerable. But there's another more difficult question which we often didn't get right in the pandemic, which is understanding which individuals are actually members of those groups, because that from quite early on you could see that there were patterns around ethnicity and mortality in the data, and that one of the questions that arose when people were thinking about how to prioritise vaccination is, well, should ethnicity be a factor? But it turned out that the data that the NHS held on ethnicity was of such poor quality that they thought it wasn't really usable for those purposes. And similarly, when it came to care homes, it looked the nature of care homes and their ownership by thousands of different small concerns in many cases meant that the data about who was in what care home, it wasn't easily centralisable, and so that even if you were aware that there are certain vulnerabilities at a group level, it became quite difficult to map that onto how to modify the way that you're treating in individuals. So that often you need to know quite a lot of detail in order to be able to make it actionable, even if you do know where the vulnerabilities are at a group level.
Thank you. Professor Busby, you've given us some views in your responses to the identification of vulnerable categories. Again, can I understand your view on the need to have, as I've put it, a bank of information that will be usable to inform decision-making, again going back to our initial observation that it has to be done in an area of uncertainty and has to be done with expedition.
Yes, there's a difference, isn't there, between vulnerability to infection and vulnerability caused by the actions that might be taken because of the pandemic. So the actions that we're talking about, the MPIs that we're discussing in this meeting. So dealing with infection, we've heard already. So the elderly people were more susceptible to this particular virus. Those with certain underlying health conditions. So we didn't know that at the outset because, as we've heard, all pandemics play out differently. But we knew that quite early on, and so certain mitigating factors could have been put in place in those circumstances. There were we've already heard about the disparities in certain ethnic groups in terms of morbidity and mortality that came to light. I think this probably wasn't predicted, and what we found there is that we don't have good disaggregated data in relation to race and ethnicity. And I know that you've heard already from some of the organisations in Scotland who support and represent those groups, BMIS, for example. And so that's something that we do need. We can prepare for that. We can begin to understand why that happened, what the factors there were. And we see things there that were to do with, for example, we've already heard the impact of poverty, but things like living conditions, the way that people live, the way that people work. For some people, a lack of sick pay, which meant that they were unable to take time off from work, even when they were ill. And this played out then in different ways than it might have done otherwise in terms of their own health prospects. Where it comes to care homes and the elderly, there's quite a lot to be said on that, and I'm sure some of that will come through in later questions. But one of the issues around care homes was I think, lack of knowledge, lack of attention paid to the fact that a lot of those care homes are provided by private providers, and the information that was shared, at least in Scotland, or the guidance that was given, related to public sector providers. And so it wasn't easy for care home workers, for those who run care homes, to act on that information and that guidance. So these things, again, I think are really important in terms of infection and how we might use information, if we have the information that we need, to make decisions about controlling infection, if that's the right way to put it, dealing with infection in the most appropriate way. There's a whole other set of vulnerabilities which are related to the consequences of lockdown and other measures, and I don't know if you want me to elaborate on those.
I think it would probably be helpful if you could,
sure,
by an outline, because I think I have a follow-up question, and it was a specific one,
of course,
because you've hinted at it already. But if you could just give us an indication of
yes,
the vulnerabilities in relation to lockdown in particular and other non-pharmaceutical interventions.
Yes, so if we think about things like social, economic and cultural impacts, my concerns would have been, and these are played out, so not an unusual view, children and young people, particularly those who live in poverty or reduced socioeconomic circumstances. Lots of children live between households. So when we were given information about, forming bubbles and, living within a household, difficult for children and their parents to make those kinds of assessments. Children who live in the care system, women and children with high levels of care responsibility. We hear of children who care for adults. Lots of women bear disproportionate amounts of care responsibility, sometimes alongside unpaid work, which can leave them vulnerable in terms of the choices they were expected to make. Some who already live in quite dangerous or risky situations. We've heard already about the victims of domestic abuse, women and children, very much affected there, who would lose all or some of their usual support mechanisms in lockdown, for example, including informal support. Then there are those groups who live without any recourse to public funds, for example, due to immigration status, visa conditions, or asylum applicants who may be left outside of national planning in this type of situation. So really anyone, I think, who doesn't fit into the standard notion of a household or a family, or on which arrangements and planning were based. So we made assumptions. I think governments have to make assumptions, but some of those assumptions don't reflect the real lives of lots of people within our society. They may already be living in difficult circumstances prior to the pandemic, and so this exacerbated those circumstances. And the assumptions that households are always autonomous, safe, adequate and secure is not a correct one, actually. We know that. But we knew that before the pandemic. I would come back to that point, that a lot of this is knowledge that we do have, and I do think that in preparing for any other future health emergency, these sorts of issues, these sorts of living conditions, working conditions, could be and should be mitigated against. And I would add to that the desperate need, actually, to collect good quality, disaggregated data on how people live and on different personal characteristics such as race and ethnicity.
Thank you. Just following on from what you've said, Professor, you've reflected really what is my follow-up question to you on that, and it's one we'll develop further in due course. The assumption that if lockdown is the NPI that is chosen, that the restriction of staying at home does not necessarily mean that one has a happy, secure home to isolate in. And we've heard that from a number of witnesses during our very extensive impact hearings, ranging from, as you've indicated, those who are subject to domestic violence, those who used the lockdown as a coercive measure on the partner who was perhaps the subject of domestic violence, the impact on children who would be there and witnessing it. We've also heard about it in the situation of those who were perhaps having difficulty with their sexuality and who were living in let's say, an unsympathetic domestic background. Is there a difficulty, and perhaps anticipating further questions, but is there a difficulty in drilling down to that level of detail in reacting to a pandemic and issuing a strict, I'll characterize it as that way, a strict lockdown.
Yes, there is, but I don't think we should be making those decisions in the face of a national health emergency. I think we should put provisions in place to improve people's lives more generally, so that people don't find themselves in those difficult situations, and where they do, they have alternatives. I think it was an afterthought. I don't think that the impact of a lockdown on, for example, the victims of domestic abuse, children and women, was thought about. I don't think it was considered until later on, actually, when it was raised by the organisations that support them and individuals themselves, although, of course, it's difficult for them to have their voices heard for obvious reasons. So I think it came through later on, but because we know those organisations exist, we know about the support that people receive, and we know about that now, so we could be doing things to help in terms of preparedness for those sorts of circumstances. But I would be in favour of thinking of ways in which we could improve people's lives without having to do it in the face of a national or international health emergency. That would be my preferred response.
Lord Sumption, could I come to you? Because you specifically mentioned in your outline initially the category of those who are vulnerable. Do you have any views beyond those which our three experts have so far alluded to in relation to identification of vulnerable people?
I won't repeat what they have said, which I largely agree with. Perhaps I can make 2 points. First is that although some vulnerabilities are specific to the particular kind of pathogen involved and are therefore extremely difficult to build up a bank of knowledge for in advance, many are absolutely general. Obviously, the state of somebody's underlying health is critically important in the context of most pathogens. One of the striking things, if you look at this historically, is that a high proportion of epidemics and pandemics have involved problems with the respiratory system. Pretty well all the flu epidemics have that characteristic, and the same has been true of some non-flu ones. So things like living conditions, underlying state of health, whether you live in enclosed communities, whether you have public-facing jobs, all of these are examples of things about which you can accumulate knowledge in advance. My second comment would be this. The knowledge that a government requires in order to deal with this is much greater if it is contemplating a coercive response than if it is contemplating a response based on informed and impartial advice. If you are contemplating a coercive response, then you must have, as it seems to me, a high degree of knowledge of how that will affect different categories. If you are contemplating a response based, at least initially, on sensible advice, then you can give your advice in terms which will enable the people receiving that advice to measure it against their own particular conditions, something which, of course, governments are at far too high a level to do.
Thank you very much. I'll go through the same order as I did. So, Professor Miles, can I have your views, if I may, on vulnerable sectors? Can I, before I specifically ask you to do that, we did hear, and we've had evidence in this inquiry last week from representatives of those who were advising the governments in Sweden and in New Zealand. And in particular, we had Dr. Anders Tegnell, who is, I think, now well known of his advice in the Swedish context. One of the things he mentioned in his autobiography is that in discussing matters with, and this is in the very early days, in discussing matters with his fellow Scandinavian epidemiologists, the question was posed, if one is going into a lockdown, well, who pays for it? And because lockdown carries with it certain implications for those who are employed, principally, but many other economic and financial consequences. So in the context of planning for and reacting to the early days of the advent of an unknown pathogen, what consideration should there be for those who are economically vulnerable?
If I may, maybe I could make a sort of very simple but general point to start with, which is that when, as is likely to be the case with most viruses, vulnerability to very serious health issues varies significantly across different groups, it's just less likely that blanket measures that affect everybody in the same way, stay at home, for example, during lockdowns, are likely to be appropriate. And when the costs of various kinds of restrictions also differ materially across different groups, it's also the case, I think, that blanket measures, such as were applied during lockdowns, are also less appropriate. I mean, they have the advantage of great simplicity, and it's easy for people to understand them, and maybe it's easier to police them, but that comes at a very high price, I think, when there are these, as will nearly always be the case, big differences in risks, health risks to different groups, and in the costs of complying with restrictions. On the economic issues, because it's part of the costs of restrictions in some ways that some people their livelihoods will be damaged very greatly by restrictions which simply stop them earning a living, and the costs of that, trying to ameliorate that, are not trivial. I mean, they certainly weren't trivial during lockdowns when the furlough scheme for people who were employed and couldn't work, and the cost of the self-employed added up to about almost £100 billion. The cost of support to businesses was another £50 billion. That pretty much all went on government debt. The reason why governments since then have struggled to stay within sustainable fiscal limits is to a significant extent, not only, but to a significant extent because those enormous costs that we all have to pay, they make it more difficult to provide resources to the health service now, to education, to defence, and the effects of that will play out for decades. And I have a sense that that was not thought about.
I think the World Bank estimate of the total financial cost is, when I last looked at it, £410 billion in the UK. That figure would need to be checked.
Thank you. I've been passed a note to ask, for the purposes of everybody hearing, if our participants could speak louder and clearer into the microphone. So I'm sorry to have to ask you to do that, but it's simply that we can get all that you're saying. Professor Kearney, again, looking at the need for informed decision-making requiring identification of vulnerable categories, from your research and your knowledge, is that something that is easily accessible? Just taking it as a a bank of evidence, a bank of information available to governments?
It's a tricky one. I think, well, can I give you a yes and a no?
Well, you can start
academic.
with that.
The no is that I think, as Professor Busby was describing, the government did not routinely and systematically gather evidence early on about vulnerable groups and the impact of COVID specifically. So therefore, it didn't pay enough attention because, you know, there was a circular problem there. It didn't have enough information. It didn't ask for it, and so on. The yes is that I think you'll have heard this from Professor Bambra and colleagues already. I would say if you work in public health research, you already know enough about inequalities to know their implications for policy. So I think the distinction I put down in my submission was you know that there will be an unequal ability to avoid any infection if it requires people to self-isolate at home because there's such a variation in people's living circumstances. You also know that there will be an unequal cost to the withdrawal of public services to support people in isolation. You know that the health harms of COVID-19 or a virus would be unequal because there's already an unequal distribution of so-called non-communicable diseases, you know, respiratory disease, cancer, heart disease, and so on. And you know that there'll be an unequal impact of measures such as lockdowns. The thing that I think is missing in the kind of government analysis, because I guess we're trying to focus on how to make the provision of information more coherent and how to make a policy response more coherent as a result. And I think the key thing here is that I think it took some time to explain or understand that the causes of inequalities in one sense would also cause inequalities in another. So the causes of non-communicable disease are often described as social determinants. That's inequalities in income and wealth. So the unequal ability to live in a warm and safe home, to live well, to live safely. Those factors contributing to unequal non-communicable diseases are also the contributors to vulnerability to communicable disease. So I think people in public health knew this, you know, in a kind of a broad sense. They knew what to anticipate. But I think it's always been a difficult proposition to explain to governments. Either, well, I can reserve judgment on why, but it is a hard argument to make about the evidence is that there are these fundamental inequalities that you should deal with.
Professor, I'd prefer that you didn't reserve judgment on why, okay, and perhaps explain to us why you think that is.
Well, I think there's always two broad explanations that your audience doesn't know or they don't care. Or they don't agree with your recommendation for action. So I think in this, I would say there's the broadest theme. I do a lot of reviews of studies, public health and climate and you know, justice and equality and such like. And the theme is always between two fundamental differences in approach to government. So one is essentially what people might call a social determinants or a social justice approach, which is high state intervention to deal with these inequalities. You know, redistribute income and wealth, high levels of public services support and such like. And the competition is a so-called neoliberal approach, which is low state intervention, much more emphasis on individual responsibility and markets. And I think the issue that sort of traditional public health people have is that their view is very much consistent with the high state intervention, and they're dealing with an audience predisposed to low state intervention. And so it's not just the communication of information, it's the communication of what you should do with it. And I think there's that double gap that you get.
Yes, your Lord Simpson, yes.
Professor Kearney has said, I think that there's another factor when it comes to getting through to politicians, which is that they are much more sensitive to immediate than to remote consequences.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of the time, but there's one matter that I think we can probably deal with relatively quickly. Let's look at lockdown as the NPI that we're dealing with. Now, I think there can be a misunderstanding about what is lockdown, and the idea that society comes to a halt as a result of lockdown. If one looks to the lockdown that we had in relation to SARS-CoV-2, society didn't come to a standstill. Society continued, retail provision, albeit restricted, continued. People still had to go to work if they couldn't work from home. There were, in the least in certain circumstances, places of hospitality that remained open. From a historic point of view, lockdown, even in the terms that we knew it during COVID-19, is there and has there been a historical precedent for that type of lockdown? I look to Lord Sumption as with his historical perspective on this.
Well, leaving aside cases of quite exceptionally infectious pathogens like the Black Death, basically pandemics are a modern phenomenon because previously there had been epidemics which were essentially local in their incidence. So one is looking, the first modern one really is the Russian flu in the 1890s, then there's the Spanish flu at the end of the First World War, the bird flu and Hong Kong flu in 58 and 67, which I think are generally thought to have been the same or very similar pathogen, and then COVID-19. I'm not aware of any historical precedent for a lockdown in the sense of a measure which is designed to isolate both healthy and unhealthy people. Quarantine arrangements which isolate people known to be infectious are as ancient as recorded history. But general lockdowns to prevent the transmission of disease to people who are not yet affected, this was an experimental measure for which there was no precedent and correspondingly more limited understanding of what its broader consequences might be.
I think we should stop there.
Thank you, Lord Secretary. We'll return to historical precedent when we return.
Very good. Thank you very much. We'll come back in 15 minutes, 1/4 the hour. seated. When everyone's ready, Mr. Gale, please
Thank you, my
start.
Lord.
Please commence.
Lord Sumption, just to go back to you, if I may, in relation to the historic perspective so far as lockdown is concerned. Again, I'm anticipating something that we'll probably discuss in more detail in due course. I think probably inherent in what you've said on the basis that lockdown is essentially unprecedented, there follows a need, if one goes down the route of lockdown, for messaging in relation to lockdown to be clear, because I suppose that the population requires to be guided in something that is entirely alien, or to behave in a way that's entirely alien to them if there's no historic precedent. Your comment briefly, and we will return to it, on the question of, and I know your position in relation to lockdown, but assuming that we have a lockdown, what about the messaging that's necessary?
I think the messaging is critically important whether we have a lockdown or not. It's arguably even more important if we don't have a lockdown, that by way of alternative, some authoritative guidance should be given. I think what the history does tell us is that the public is a lot more sensitive and a lot more risk-averse now than it was, for example, in the 1960s, when measures were considered but not adopted, as we know from internal government documents in the 60s in Britain and I think also in the United States. It was deliberately decided that it was better not to worry people or to disrupt the daily rhythms of life. Now, that is partly reflects the fact that the Hong Kong and bird flu were not as mortal or as transmissible as most variants of COVID. But I think it also reflects a quite significant change in public opinion.
Can I go to Professor Parker in relation to the what Lord Sumption has described, and I paraphrase, the unprecedented nature of lockdown as we had it in COVID. Do you have any comments on how one should reflect that in the providing of advice on an ethical platform?
Yeah, one thing I would, I guess, it's not something that's going to lead to a lockdown, but I would, I guess, add HIV to the list as a pandemic. But yeah, I mean, the key questions are going to be ones to do with, is there any chance this is going to work? Is one thing, and there are huge questions about whether it's going to make a difference, and then there are and that will vary, and then there are questions about whether it can be justified given the costs and our other concerns, which are sometimes going to be about harms that we've already talked about and vulnerabilities, and sometimes going to be about important values, liberty, privacy, and so on. And so I think, one of the things that I would have hoped, if I were sort of speaking to government very early on, is that it would be made very clear to decision makers, but also to the public, that there are many of the most important decisions that will be made are going to be value judgments. It's going to be important to pay attention to evidence, but making it clear that the uncertainties we've already discussed, the vulnerabilities of all sorts, but these will be questions of value that will need to be explained in nuanced ways that don't avoid, as it were, the difficulties, and don't avoid the fact that there are trade-offs that need to be made, often in the context of uncertainty, but will need to be justified. So I would, going to the Q&A, I very much agree with what Lord Sumption said, but the one thing I would add is just being much more open and clear about the fact that these are value questions, ultimately.
Because I think in your response, Professor Parker, at paragraph 1.5, you do indicate that, in your view, the right of the population to have communicated to it clear information is a right, albeit a non-legal right, but it is at least a moral or ethical right to allow decisions to be made as to compliance with whatever restriction is imposed.
One has to obviously take into account the fact that much won't be known. So, so clarity will often be clarity about uncertainty and clarity about the possibility that things might change in the future. And I think associated with that, with something that we might perhaps in ethics want to think of as sort of epistemic virtue, really, that knowledge matters, the facts matter, and our approach and our relationship to knowledge and uncertainty is important. So these would be things that I think would be important. And yes, clear communication, even if information that is partial to some degrees, or partial in the sense that it's not complete, I think is really there's a moral and other kinds of obligations to do that.
And I think perhaps anticipating again something we will touch on is the question of updating information and reacting to changed circumstances as the need for messaging continues. Is that something that exercises you?
I think one of the most important clusters of obligations in the context of an emergency and many other kind of difficult situations is it relates to the epistemic virtue question, is the obligation to undertake research, to evaluate interventions, particularly in relation to social impacts, but also in terms of other kind of things we've been talking about today. So I would argue there's a very strong obligation to do research. That may take different forms given the emergency context from the very beginning, and for that to inform decision making and to change as appropriate. I think that's a way of building trust. This kind of nuance. British Academy produced a report recently which was about trust in science rather than, but it strongly emphasised that, for the public, being open about nuances, uncertainties, and these sort of value questions is actually a driver of trust, even though instinctively we might feel it has the potential to undermine trust. So I think a degree of openness about these things is really important. But the research also has, doing research, learning in a structured way, let's put it that way, there are obligations to do that in the current pandemic, say, but also there's a bit of a analogy to some extent with climate change. We have obligations to future generations to do the best to understand what's happening, to experiment with different models of responding, learn what we can, and pass that knowledge on, as this inquiry is doing.
Thank you. Professor Wilson, from a philosophical standpoint, we have a situation which, I'll just put it generally, is unprecedented in terms of what may be contemplated in relation to the non-pharmaceutical intervention. What concerns does that present from a philosopher's point of view?
I think from a philosopher's perspective, the unprecedented nature of what we faced, maybe it raised maybe threats and also opportunities for governments. On the one hand, insofar as you're facing a threat which is genuinely unprecedented and a government can articulate that, then it sort of clears the way for an unprecedented response to it. So that I think that many people were surprised that we ended up with lockdown as the solution. It hadn't been part of the pandemic planning. It's not something that had been debated in ethics literature beforehand. But that given the framing of the problem and how dire the situation appeared to be at the time when lockdown was announced, it came to seem as perhaps inevitable, at least for a short time, that would be what would be required. And so that in many ways, if you're going to take action which is unprecedented, you need to be able to show that the circumstances warrant it. And insofar as the circumstances do warrant it, then maybe that's exactly what is required.
Yes. Professor Busby, can I just ask you, from your perspective as an academic with such experience in human rights and social justice, to give your view on the way in which decision makers could react to such an unprecedented occurrence?
Yes, I agree with everything that's been said. I think in particular the messaging has to, I mean, will it work is a difficult question because you probably don't know that when you're taking the decision. But in the light of impact assessments, you might be able to give some degree of, certainty is the wrong word, but an indication of what you're trying to achieve. And I think that information should be shared. I think people should be given credit for being able to understand messaging from governments around these sorts of decisions. As long as there is an indication in the information that's given that the costs have been taken account of, at least in a preliminary way, based on the information available. And I mean social as well as economic costs. I think where there are impacts on values, we've heard maybe some human rights as well, because a lockdown will impose restrictions on other freedoms and protections. I think that sort of information, where it's possible to share it in an accessible way, should also be made available. So an explanation of why the decision is being made and the basis on which it's been made, I think should be as transparent as possible. Transparency really matters because you're asking people to buy into something. And I remember, when we had the first lockdown, we were waiting for, all of us, I think, were waiting for something to happen, to be told what to do, because of the uncertainty that we knew we were living in. And so it came as a bit of a relief, actually, for many people, that was the decision. But we had no idea going into it how long it would last for and what it would really mean in terms of our day-to-day lives. So I think information is really important for those reasons, so that people, if it's seen as a necessary action, and in some circumstances it will be, you have that buy-in, you have that public trust, which is really important. It was important last time. It will probably be harder to garner next time, I would imagine. And I think the sharing of information, including equality and human rights impact assessments, to put it that way, is really important in terms of building public confidence in the decisions that governments take.
And presumably communicating those assessments.
Yes.
Professor Kearney, can I turn to you, if I may? Again, we're looking at this stage at the unprecedented nature of the threat and indeed the potential reaction to that threat. What particular difficulties, if any, does that provide for the decision makers?
Lots. I was just thinking of the previous responses first. I think if you give us enough time, we could tie ourselves in knots on things like communication, because there are clear trade-offs here in terms of what we want from them. So I think if you want to show respect to many citizens, you try and explain to them lots of nuance and details, and you show them that you're wrestling with these issues. I think if you want to reach as many people as possible with the same information, you don't do any of that. You give them the most simple message you can think of to signal some level of authority in you and what you want them to do. So I think that was, the UK was the stay home, wasn't it? Save lives, protect the NHS type stuff. That was the reasoning there. There's also this issue about projecting authority. So I think that's what you would see here. At times, it was difficult to know if governments should project their political authority as elected people making decisions, or rely on scientific authority to communicate. And I think that was a feature of a lot of the early presentation of the virus, that for some time there was a very strong reliance on scientists explaining the virus and what to do, and then there was this tipping point. The trickier thing in Scotland is it's unclear how to project authority that is shared across governments. So if the question was about how should the Scottish Government communicate these things, that's very different from the UK Government, because often it will communicate the sense that it is part of a so-called four nations approach with the UK. So we are all acting together for your benefit type thing. And that's different from a UK government messaging, which is we are responsible, therefore we will be responsible. So I think there's all that. I don't think there's one way of coming to a decision on that in terms of what you communicate and when. Instead, they're just wrestling with these things. I think it's the same with the deliberations up to the point of lockdown. The question was, for example, what combination of measures would be most effective given before lockdown, the question really was implicitly, given that we won't lock down, what are the most effective measures we can have? You know, school closures, you know, hospitality and such like large crowds. Then there was a tipping point on lockdown that changed the question they were asking. So I think that's worth delving into in terms of at what point they were trying to answer different questions based on a shift in what they thought was feasible. So there was that sense things were unprecedented in January. They weren't so unprecedented in February because Italy had a lockdown, so that changed a calculus. And I think some of those things are important in terms of the frames of reference. So I think when people saw lockdown in China, I think the UK government position and their scientific advice was this is not a comparable experience to inform us. When things happen in Western Europe, that changes the calculus. So I think they're trying to deal with how to communicate, given that people are getting their information from these other sources too. Yeah, so I think it's a very, very blurry picture. It's hard to know at what point they would shift their thinking towards, should we consider this thing we haven't considered before? And I guess that was sort of probably March when they were becoming serious about that. So I think there'll be those two phases in terms of those deliberations.
Okay. Professor Miles, turning to you, what we were facing in early part of 2020 was on the basis that it was unprecedented. From an economist's point of view, similarly unprecedented, and concerns which would largely be novel to economists. Am I right in thinking that, to begin with? Or is it something that can be factored in?
I don't think there had been much experience of the most restrictive measures, lockdowns, and what they might mean. Although we learned about that pretty quickly when it became clear how many people weren't able to get to work, and also the build-up of things that would have costs in the future, closing schools, people not being able to attend GP surgeries or have procedures done or tests or scans. I think that did become clear quite quickly. If I may make one point about information and communication, I think the most powerful piece of information and communication came from the daily announcements. I think I recall it was pretty much daily, about how many new cases had arisen that day, how many people had died with COVID, not necessarily because of COVID, but with COVID. And I think that had a huge impact. Two in particular. Firstly, just those numbers made it much easier to impose lockdowns, but perhaps paradoxically, they also reduced the benefit of lockdowns, because I think those numbers were generating very substantial changes in behaviour, particularly of people who came to understand that people around them, in their family or others, were at risk, were adapting their behaviour. So the thing that made compliance with lockdowns perhaps greater than people might have anticipated, in some ways also reduced the value of lockdowns because people were responding to the same thing, which was these dramatic announcements every day. How many more thousand people, new cases of the virus, how many people had died that day. I think it also did another thing, coming back to something Lord Sumption mentioned before the break, which was the difference, an understandable difference in politicians in thinking about time horizons for costs and benefits. Because of the sort of drama every day of how many new cases were reported that day, how many people had died that day, for perfectly understandable reasons, that became, in some ways, the single most important thing that policymakers were reacting to. But the costs of the most restrictive policy, lockdowns, were kind of quite far in the future. I mean, it wasn't that you couldn't predict that they were coming, but they simply weren't the dramatic focus of the media. And I think we're kind of paying for that now, because the bill comes in later.
Lord Sumption, can I just ask you, you've heard the other panelists' comments. Do you have anything further to say in relation to what has been said by your colleagues?
Only this, that I think that government messaging is very important. I entirely agree with the point that's just been made, that government messaging may to some extent be a substitute for the more extreme NPIs, because people will, in fact, they have a sufficient sense of self-preservation to respond to information in the way that they organise their lives without the need for coercion. But the main point I think should be made is that messaging should be objective. It should not be designed simply to frighten people into complying with decisions which politicians have already made, possibly for other reasons. And I think that there was too much of the use of messaging as propaganda to frighten people, and not enough of the more sensible kind of messaging that had, for example, in England come from the chief medical officer before lockdowns were imposed, which is much more balanced.
Yes. I think that if nobody objects to the use of this language, in one of the very early statements I read in this inquiry, it was from an elderly lady who was had a number of medical conditions, but she had adjusted her life to those conditions. And the one thing she said in her statement, and pardon the language, she said, the problem with the messaging that I was receiving was I had the shit scared out of me. Is that something that I put probably more crudely than you did?
Yes, I mean it's making the same point, and yes. I think that it's a sound point. Things like the Google movement data indicate that there was a very widespread adjustment to people's daily patterns of life even before any lockdown was imposed.
Yeah.
Yes. If politicians have a tendency to use the transmitting of messages in relation to a pandemic, possibly for their own purposes, whatever they may be, might there be merit in politicians either removing themselves or, by other means, politicians being removed from the oracle role?
Well, that, of course, is effectively what did happen in Sweden.
Yes.
When the messaging was basically made the responsibility of the state epidemiologist. The problem about politicians This isn't an invariable problem, but because, in fact, at the early stages of the pandemic, the reputation of politicians was sky high. Mm-hmm. It then declined quite rapidly as the pandemic continued. But people may distrust politicians for a variety of reasons completely unconnected with the issue that they happen to be talking about at the moment, i.e. the pandemic. And for that reason, I think that it is usually more sensible for people with less skin in the political game to be responsible for the messaging.
Thank you.
They can also be expected to take a more long-term view.
Thank you very much. Can I turn to a different matter in the context again of the early days of reacting or anticipating and reacting to this pandemic we've just been through. And this relates to the significance of forecasting in the context of preparing for such an emergency. The matter I'm interested in is in considering forecasting. Is it, in your view, essential or desirable that forecasting provides a range of forecasts with input from other disciplines and not just, with all due respect, the epidemiologists' input? Professor Parker, you were a member of SAGE, so I think we can go to you first on that.
Yeah, I think. Well, first of all, I joined SAGE after that first decision had been made, but but I still was in the room when people were talking about it. I guess the first thing is you're absolutely right. One thing is to do, coming back to communications point. I do think there's something problematic about the term forecasting here to some degree. I think we need to be, and actually the epidemiologists that I listen to, so people talking about their models of various kinds, some are more confident than others, but it was very common. In fact, every time I think I heard a presentation, the person started by saying, "This is not a prediction." So it's very careful at a sort of scientific level to say what we're trying to do here is to enrich to some extent the decision-making landscape, and there are uncertainties and bands of probability and so on around these things. So the communication counts, really very importantly, both in communication to policymakers who may take things as more like predictions than they are, and also the public. Nonetheless, I think the provision of statistically, useful statistical information about the range of possible, with different degrees of possible likelihood, as it were, the landscape, and it being a probabilistic landscape, seems to me, essential. It seems essential that is taken into account. There's a question about how much weight is placed on it and how it's communicated. I do also very much agree with the point that shouldn't just be about epidemiology and disease spread. Disease spread itself is dependent upon a whole range of questions, as Lord Sumption mentioned earlier, to do with social and behavioural changes of various kinds. So I would want to see that landscape enriched by other kinds of data, more socially connected. But I would also want to see, an element of that which is to do with mapping the values landscape. But so I'm not against the input of that kind of science. But I think that we need to be careful about how we label it and how we use it.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wilson. Again, perhaps the same question to you. Do you? What is your view on? I won't use the word forecasting. I'll use predicting.
Yeah, I think that modelling is absolutely vital, but that any mathematical modeller is going to say that what a mathematical model is a simplified sort of vision of a potential way the world could unfold, and it provides a way of testing what the implications of certain assumptions are, and that one of those reasons is that you can then sort of put different values into the model, think, well, how would things change if we're slightly wrong about how infective the disease is, and you can model that differently. So it provides a way of thinking rigorously about certain sorts of assumptions, and that thinking about models in that way, see that they're always going to be fallible tools, and that they're really only going to be as useful as the quality of the inputs that we go into them. If we're wrong about certain key variables, then they're likely to give us misleading results. And I think that's one of the ways in which that maybe the humanities and social sciences can help us to enrich this, to think about, well, what are the sorts of implications or assumptions behind this, so that, just to give one example, when we were working on the ethics advisory board for the COVID app, we could see that there are certain assumptions that were built into the models that the people might have been thinking about. Well, if they assumed that the app was going to be effective at slowing the progress of the pandemic, it turned out that there's quite a strong assumption there that if people get an alert on their phone telling them to self-isolate, then they'll comply with that. And we sort of then did some further sort of digging and data and thinking, well, how realistic is that if we were to talk to people and find out the ways in which people tend to respond to alerts on their phone, is that realistic? And so you can see that, as it were, that thinking more holistically, bring a large number of people into the room allows you to think much more rigorously about the assumptions that you might put in place in your mathematical models. I might say one more thing which you didn't ask, but which is related to this, almost about which sorts of models governments ought to consider. Because one of the features of the pandemic was that not just, as it were, a variety of models being produced which were looked at by SAGE, but it became a matter of almost amateur people on the internet could actually sort of get the data and make their own models. Sometimes even quite sort of eminent people who were brilliant scientists in other fields thought, well, they'd have a go at it, and as well. And so you had a variety of apparent sort of forecasts, often which were taken up in newspapers and so on. So I think it became quite sort of difficult and complex. I think there is a serious set of questions about almost sort of the degree to which governments should take account of the mathematical models that are produced by people who as it were, don't do that for a living.
Well, we'll come inevitably to the question of misinformation in due course. But perhaps a question for both of you. Modelling, and we've heard some evidence in this inquiry about the extent to which modelling had failed. The question, I suppose, is it essential that modelling should be a tool to revise the decisions that are taken, rather than simply being a tool for the initial decision and left there? Is it essential? I put it to both of you. Whichever one wants to ask, please answer, please do so.
I guess the important thing to say in response is, what would be the alternative to not having any model? Yes. Because I think you'd be flying entirely blind as a government trying to plan any kind of response. And that maybe it might be useful to sort of unpick a little bit about what's solid data versus what needs to be modelled. So you might have solid data, for example, about the number of tests that have been undertaken, but there's a whole set of other questions about how reflective is the number of tests that have been undertaken of the broader level of infection within society. You need to do that by modelling it, and that the data that politicians had access to, or that scientists had access to, was quite sparse. That's to say, you had a sort of pockets of data, you had data points, and you need to be able to extrapolate that out in order to think, well, what does this tell us about the population as a whole? And if you didn't have some ability to do that sort of using sort of mathematical modelling, you wouldn't have no idea, for example, when it was likely that we might see the peak of infections, or when things might be dropping off, or when, for example, it might be necessary to have a circuit breaker lockdown, all those sorts of discussions that the governments needed to have. If you didn't have the mathematical modelling at all, you'd have been entirely in the dark. And even though, as it were, the models were imperfect in all sorts of ways, and those making the models knew they were imperfect, as it were, to have tried to get by without them, I think would have been far worse.
Yes, sorry.
Sorry.
Well, just to answer the other part of your question, which is, I think, should data be used in real time, as it were, to manage policy? And I think my earlier answer about research and the collection of data and the systematic development of knowledge over the course of an incident like this is, that's an obligation. I think we should actually do that. And some of that will be about modelling, but some of it will be about other kinds of data. We know from recent stories that there are all sorts of questions about the data sources that are available, whether it's the Office of National Statistics Service, that there are all sorts of questions about the certainty of the data, so that needs to be taken into account. But I think there's another question. I would be interested to know what Professor Kearney thinks about this, because I think, to some extent, I'm not, I don't have data for this, but my guess is that if you change policy too often, you might lose people, and you might lose confidence, as it were, in your ability to manage the country, as it were, or the health system. So it may well be there's a bit of a trade-off there. I mean, we'd want our policies to be responsive to data and changes. We'd certainly want that, but we wouldn't want it for other reasons, perhaps flip-flopping in ways that led the public and health professionals think, what the hell's going on here? So it feels there may well be a trade-off there.
Thank you. Professor Kearney, Professor Wilson's, Professor Parker has directed the next consideration to you, so I'll simply pass it to you.
Okay, I mean, it was one of, I suppose it does take me to one of my sort of high-level points, which would be if you asked scientists and political scientists to design how to behave as a policymaker, it would be ridiculously bad, because, so I would have emphasised, the policy process and its environment is so complex, you will never know what is going on or what will be any impact of anything you do. So therefore, your best response is, I think, what someone like me would call trial and error. Okay, you take one decision, you see what happens, you learn, and you take another decision. Now I think that's excellent scientific decision making, but it's horrible political decision making, because the main aim of a Westminster government or a Scottish government is to project authority and certainty. Trust us, we know what we're doing, and we've made a decision, and it's authoritative. It's difficult for a government to appear at a press conference each day and say, I think this might work, but I don't know, I'll tell you tomorrow. And so I think that's the position they're in. They essentially have to perform certainty when they don't accept it. And I think that's the context for forecasting. In a political environment, people interpret forecasting as authoritative estimates of what will happen. But in a scientific context, forecasting is nothing of the sort. It is, it's modelling, or it is there for scenario generation. If you want to make the best use of forecasting, you say, let me give you a series of realistic scenarios so that you can be prepared to think about the choices you would make in those scenarios. It wouldn't be, this is going to happen, you have to do something. So.
Thank you. Professor Miles, your comment on the topic.
It builds in some ways on what Professor Kearney just said, and it's the difference between a model used to describe a scenario and how that might play out, and a forecast of what you think will most likely happen. I think I'm right in saying that probably the most impactful model-based projection made was by the group that I think was led by epidemiologists at Imperial College, which, if I recall correctly, projected that under certain circumstances there could be 500,000 deaths in the UK in a relatively short period of time. Again, if I remember correctly, that was in a sense, it was a scenario based on a particular assumption, and the key assumption was that there would be no change in behaviour, that people would not respond to the obvious risks of certain sorts of behaviour as deaths piled up. That didn't make it an invalid exercise, but the meaning of that forecast, I think, projection, I should say, projection of a particular scenario based on an assumption which clearly would not have played out. I'm not saying it was an internally inconsistent assumption. It just said this is what would happen in a counterfactual world in which people didn't notice and respond to how dangerous this virus was. I suspect, I don't know, I suspect it wasn't interpreted that way by policymakers who said, we now have to do something very dramatic. And I suspect it was a major factor behind the first lockdown. That doesn't mean that models such as those used by epidemiologists aren't useful. I think they're very useful. But to produce a prediction of what might happen, you need to go beyond a scenario with assumptions and question whether the assumptions are plausible. And it wasn't plausible, if you were trying to forecast what was likely to happen, to assume that there'd be no change in behaviour as deaths grew exponentially. I think I conclude from this that models are very useful. But if you're predicting what might be most likely to happen, one has to also model alongside the epidemiology of the phenomena the response of people. And epidemiologists are quite modest people, I think. They don't claim to have very good models of that. But you need that to guide policy.
Thank you. An assumption, I think I'm probably moving to an area on which you particularly have an opinion. Professor Miles has just indicated that based on modelling, the model predicts what would happen without something like lockdown, and therefore the behaviour of people is guided by those restrictions. Do you feel that that could be left, could safely be left to the intelligence of people to react to what is being said?
Well, I don't think that people necessarily react to specific models as opposed to the bigger picture of what's going on. But I mean, I basically agree entirely with the reservations about models and the use sometimes made of them that have been expressed by both Professor Miles and Professor Kearney. Models are a useful way of testing hypotheses on a comparable basis. They are not predictions. They can give a spurious precision to what is an inherently imprecise process, and they can therefore have a very misleading impact on the public. I think that models are useful, but you have to have reservations about the way that they are treated as predictions that call for particular responses. One has to remember that they are partial, that they are speculative, and that they can be quite rapidly out of date as information develops.
Thank you. Professor Busby, can I just turn to you? From your perspective, we've heard comments from your colleagues on predicting. Do you see any particular difficulties with relying upon predictions?
Yes, for all the reasons that have already been put forward by my panel members. I'm no expert on this, but we do, what I would say, and it's in respect of the range of forecasts or information that might be included in modelling in preparation, perhaps for a health emergency, rather than in real time as we're dealing with an unfolding health emergency, which is quite a different set of circumstances. We now have the opportunity, I think, to learn from a range of research, focused research, much of it done by social scientists, by those in the humanities, as well as scientists, and some of it including really important lived experience testimony. And this research highlights and documents, as I've already alluded to, the social, economic and cultural impacts of actions that are taken and might be taken during a future health emergency. And I do feel strongly that it should be part of the broad evidence base that informs any future preparation or strategy. And I think there is support for that view from scientists, from epidemiologists themselves. There is now some research which talks about the failure of purely scientific forecasting, and that's attributed to things like, we've already heard some of this, data gaps, difficulties or problems with the quality, the reliability of data, a lack of transparency and peer review of the data used, homogeneous assumptions as a basis for modelling, which can be flawed, and the complexity of modelling, which can make it very abstract and then remove it from real life scenarios. And so I think for all of those reasons, joined up thinking matters very much in preparation, if we're using modelling or forecasting as a preparation for playing out different scenarios, different hypotheses of how governments or other decision makers might make their decisions in the future. And I think on that basis, we should use a range of evidence, including health, economic and social impact evidence, alongside perhaps the more traditional epidemiological evidence.
Okay. Professor Wilson, you were nodding to that. Is there anything you would like to say further on it?
I just add a couple of things that maybe a lot of the discussions we've had so far, often we've been able to make use of kind of hindsight. So in a way, we're trying to sort of unpick what a set of decisions that governments had to rush to make over a period of a week or two, and think about how ideally we want to take those decisions, and that given the speed at which decisions needed to be taken in the context of the 2020 pandemic, in a way, sort of maybe the best that could plausibly be hoped for is people think, well, what data can we get our hands on now? How can we put it together the best as we can in order to help us kind of at least have something to guide where we're going and to iterate from. And so, I mean, a lot of what happened during the pandemic was an enormous effort put into improving the quality of the data that was available. So it's one of the maybe things that Patrick Vallance did as the chief scientific advisor, would say, well, we need sort of these overall national data sets in order to basically improve our sense of understanding the data on which we're going to be building our models. So a lot of that data just wasn't really there at the beginning, and so that maybe the question for anybody trying to act in the circumstances of A, uncertainty, and B, when you have to make the decision really quickly, is what can we do in order to improve our line of sight, to make our ability to make sensible choices better than it was, and what other data can we bring on stream as fast as we can once we can get that up to a level of data quality that we're happy with.
So if one was looking at a potential piece of advice to future decision makers in relation to pandemic preparedness, would it include, and I very much summarize this and put it perhaps colloquially, it would be a good idea to have other people in the room?
Indeed, yes.
Thank you. Perhaps related to what we've just been discussing, could I ask perhaps a question that is focused by the reaction to early modelling in the context of SARS-CoV-2, and if the forecasting predictions suggests that there is the possibility that the health emergency will be so severe that it could overwhelm the finite resources of the health service. And we'll come to trade-offs and balances in due course. Do you feel that there is a pressure, or there was a pressure, for lockdown to become either a legal or an ethical imperative? Professor Parker, can we come to you first?
So I think a lot, again, not to repeat the discussion, a lot depends on what's known at the time, and also a lot depends on the available alternatives. What range of things could be done to achieve not necessarily the same goal, but a goal that would be reasonable and would be acceptable. Nuffield Council has a nice sort of hierarchy of public health interventions, and so the ladder, I think they call it the ladder of public health interventions. So there is a question about what other tools are available, what might they achieve, perhaps combined with communication and so on, and what kind of behaviour might we expect anyway in the context of this. So the whole range of considerations that are clearly relevant to this decision. It's important, I think, to have a range of tools available. And to have a sense of when they might be needed and when they might work and when they might be justified. Again, these are all subject to kind of uncertainty, etc., etc. So, but I think there may well be a time when if the risk is so high, partly because of these other implications of hospitals being overwhelmed, which are non-COVID related, a whole range of other things that might happen. There may well be an obligation to use. Something which imposes a great deal on people's liberty, but it would clearly need to be justified, and the decision would need to be made in the context of a whole range of other considerations. I think a huge amount here depends on the nature of the pathogen as well. So we've got a tendency, I think, as we, the problem before this pandemic is we were thinking in flu-like terms. Now there's a danger we might think in COVID-like terms, and it seems. The history I'm not an expert on history, but it may well be that these kinds of things are more likely than other kinds of pathogens. But if you look at the WHO list of priority pathogens and so on, it's possible that we could end up with a much worse situation than we did, and we need to at least have that in mind when we're doing preparation.
Thank you. What I asked you is inherent, I suppose, in what I'm saying. Is an element of public pressure arising from what is conveyed in the prediction that is conveyed or is reacted to by politicians. Do you feel that there is a way, perhaps, is there a way of balancing that, and is it desirable that be balanced?
I think I might have missed did you say the last part again?
Yes, certainly.
I understand what you're asking.
Yes, when that information is conveyed, as it would be to decision makers, is there some political pressure or some public pressure on politicians as the decision makers to go for if I can put it this way, the extreme reaction to that?
I think different politicians and and policymakers under different circumstances might be pulled in different directions. In some situations, people may be very, very wary of doing that for a whole range of political reasons and may underreact. In other cases, and I think the example we just heard, the pressure, as it were, was to do something and to do something which showed, which reflected the perceived seriousness of the event and the sense of responsibility that politicians felt. I think it may go. So there will be those pressures. They might pull in different directions. I think the key thing is that politicians are supposed to be showing leadership in these kind of situations and behaving in ways that are, in ways where justifications are provided for their decisions and where they can be held accountable later on. We all make mistakes, but I think there is an obligation there may be an obligation to say things and do things which are unpopular, and that may go in actually in either direction, I think.
Mr. Wilson, do you have a comment on that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd like to bring into play is the thought that maybe sometimes the public will get it right on these matters. That the economist and philosopher Amartya Sen has written a lot about famines, and he points out that there's never been a famine in a democracy. Whenever a famine occurs, it tends to be under authoritarian governments. And his thought is that, well, the reason for that is that no government could ever survive if you had a free press, you had access to information, if it became known that people were starving in their thousands on its watch. And I think that sort of sense of citizen voice and requirement to do something can be really powerful. It's something that governments need to think about. And that maybe one thing that's, even at this remove, quite difficult to get a handle on the facts of, but that if we're in a situation where if the government did nothing, if the government didn't lock down, there would be unconscionably large loss of life, then the citizens might sort of treat it as very similar to the famine scenario, that say, well, how could a government possibly do this on their watch? And that's maybe what the kind of pressure that governments thought they were facing, and maybe they were rightly facing that pressure right at that particular moment in March.
But surely the government's obligation to listen to the public cannot be absolute. They must also have, as the Professor has said, objective reasons for taking a decision. That would be immoral if they proceeded without objective reasoning to support them.
No, I would completely accept that. I think maybe just I wanted to put in play another potential argument, because I mean it seemed sort of too easy to jump to the thought, well, the government, as it were, doesn't need to take the public view seriously on this. And I think that maybe sort of for many governments, whether in Scotland or elsewhere, one of the values they placed at the heart of their pandemic response was that of solidarity, the idea that we're in this together, the idea that's part of what it meant for the state to be protecting values, and that as it were, can require the states, as it were, to take decisions which may lead to long-term costs, just in order to avoid sort of unconscionable things happening to people in the short term. Or at least that's a possibility that some governments wrestled with.
We are, I suppose, drifting into the question of political reaction in this, and the situation that I posited in my initial question was the extreme prediction of overwhelming the health service and the pressure that would create so far as politicians are concerned. Lord Sumption, can I have your view, if I may, on that situation and the element of political pressure that may or may not exist?
The public, this is an issue that very frequently arises in many different contexts, quite unrelated to COVID. The public will often demand measures that go well beyond what can be objectively justified. And I agree with the view that's been expressed that politicians have a moral, indeed I would say a political duty to stick to what can be justified. It is the difference between politics and statesmanship.
You use the word justified. So far as political decision-making is concerned, do we also have regard to politicians achieving what is the possible?
What is
possible?
Certainly.
Yes.
But I mean, that's in a sense a different issue.
Yes.
The governments act under the constraints. They can never launch themselves into impossible endeavours, not if they're sensible. I think that there was a feeling at the very early stages of the pandemic that it might be possible to eliminate COVID entirely. And that is a good example of something that the public would have liked to see, but governments should have been aware was not going to happen.
Yes. Thank you. Looking at this from a human rights perspective, Professor Busby, if we had this situation, as indeed it might be thought we did, where the advice was that the health emergency could be so severe that it would overwhelm the health service, do you see there being any imperative in terms of human rights for a government to act in a particular way?
Yes. Again, you know, we're in the territory of forecasting, and we spoke about the difficulties with that. But yes, I think it is a scenario where the ends might justify the means. So if it is the accepted wisdom that the health emergency is so severe that the finite resources of the health service are likely to be overwhelmed, yes, I think it would be a matter for engaging some appropriation of the right to life, Article 2, under the European Convention of Human Rights. But I qualify that by saying that the measure would have to be both timely and effective in doing what you're setting out to do. And I think the uncertainty around that might be difficult to make that a possibility or an informed judgment to make in real time. There are real difficulties with that. So I suppose you're then in the territory of, well, you have to do something. So there's a limit to that. I think you have to look at quite a limited lockdown and then see what happens as a result of that. I also think the danger with basing these sorts of decisions on forecasting, we've alluded to it in the answers to the previous question, is that the forecasting may, by the time you take the action, be out of date. So, you know, that might have looked like the perceived wisdom, but now things have changed and shifted, and they did in the pandemic in the early days. So it's a question of balancing those uncertainties. But yes, there are compelling reasons why you might be able to say, as the decision maker, well, the right to life is an unqualified right under Article 2. We have to protect it, not at all costs. There's a balancing exercise to be done in relation to that, but certainly it would come into play here, and it would be something that should be part and foremost, actually, in the decision making around that type of scenario.
Professor Miles, this scenario that I've predicated my question on, of information being such that the threat of the virus and pandemic could overwhelm the resources of the health service. From an economist's point of view, do you feel that takes one to an imperative to do something which is hitherto unprecedented and maybe quite extreme?
I mean, it might, depending on the evidence. I mean, it could be justified by the evidence that the wisest choice, and one that's proportionate to the risk and the danger, is that there should be a short period, hopefully a short period, of blanket and very intrusive restrictions. So I certainly wouldn't say that couldn't be the case. It certainly could be the case. I think the issue then is, as the period of these very extreme restrictions continues and it changes the dynamics of the risks, it would be very important to be adjusting the policy as quickly as one can to keep the balance between what could be very high costs of restrictions but very substantial benefits of those restrictions in line with each other, or in fact keeping the benefits ahead of the costs. And in the specific example of the lockdowns during COVID, I don't think that quite happened.
You say you don't think that quite happened.
Well,
can you
yes,
explain
yes,
why,
certainly.
both why you think it didn't happen, and perhaps speculate? I appreciate that.
Because the likely scale of the benefits in terms of reducing the chance of the health system being overwhelmed and reducing the number of deaths, although those benefits were substantial, as the lockdowns continued going from weeks to months to several months, the scale of the costs, I think, began to run ahead of the benefits in an environment where there were alternatives to extreme lockdowns which were substantially less costly.
Does Lord Sumption want to say something?
Some sorry.
Well, this may not be the right point of the evidence to deal with it, but I did want to say something about the human rights aspect.
Yes.
Which Professor Busby has dealt with. I mean, I think one's got to be quite careful about this. First point to make is that the Strasbourg court has tended to deal with health issues under Article 8 rather than Article 2, which is an important difference because Article 2 is unqualified, and therefore the court is extremely cautious about treating it as applicable, whereas Article 8 has a variety of qualifications by reference to other public interests which may point the other way. The second point to make about the human rights position is that the Strasbourg court, although it is a very interventionist court, has been extremely reticent about suggesting exactly what governments should do. By far the most significant decision on this one is the recent decision of the European Court of Human Rights on the Swiss climate change case, Klima Senior in der Schweiz against Switzerland. That was decided, I think, in June last year. And the court basically held that there was an obligation to do something, but was quite careful to say that it was not the function of the court to determine exactly what should be done. The objective could be identified by the court, but the means of achieving it should not. Now, one needs, this is a very developing field of law, and therefore one shouldn't be too dogmatic about any of these statements. But at the moment, it very much looks as if the question whether we deal with this by way of lockdowns or whether we deal with it by way of less intrusive measures is not a point on which the court has even come close to saying that the law prescribes an answer.
Thank you.
Can I raise a sort of tangential point there? We've used, and understandably used, the term lockdown throughout. I noticed that Professor Miles used a different phrase. He talked about blanket and very intrusive restrictions. I happen to be very unenthusiastic about the term lockdown. I think, from more or less exactly the same reasons as Professor Miles has identified, I prefer to talk, and I've raised this with the epidemiologists as well, I prefer to talk about restrictions, which can be mild or severe, and they are varied. And in fact, government should look at all possibilities of restrictions, and I think you have made that very clear, Professor Parker.
Well,
the panel's views on that matter.
Lockdowns are an extreme form of restriction. But the problem about talking about restrictions is that one's talking about quite a broad category,
Right.
which may include a large number of other things. Yeah. Lockdowns are what actually happened, and although the term is imprecise, it's acquired a more precise meaning from a considerable amount of usage over the last 4 years.
True.
So, which is why I suspect people will continue to use it. But, I mean, restrictions is a broader category.
Sorry.
No, thank you, my Lord. Professor Kearney, can I come to you? I'm now chastened to not use the term lockdown, but I will no doubt fall into the trap of using it. But this situation of information being given to a government, which may suggest the overwhelming of a health service, and the pressure that that creates on decision makers, who are, at the moment, always going to be political figures. Your reaction to that? How do you feel that? Is that a fair burden to place on decision makers and in particular politicians?
I mean, short answer, yes. I mean, in the most basic terms, ministers are elected to make these choices, and they shouldn't abdicate them with deference to expertise. I feel like that's more like a Oxford debate or something like that. But I think they should. I think there's also, I've been taking notes on the, not to be too clever, but I think the reason to use behavioural insights with forecasting is you can't assume a typical citizen. A lot of behavioural work is to say what would people actually do in these circumstances. And I think that's a useful perspective here. If we use that phrase "in the room," these are choices being made in the room. My impression, in terms of who is putting pressure on who in a room, is that, for example, SAGE. My impression is that it was almost all on Zoom, and so I think this is worth. This changes how I think about it when I describe it. If you imagine, say, 50+ people on a Zoom call giving information to each other, it's a very different image from if you picture like a discussion here in this room. My impression is that that was really an opportunity for scientists to talk to each other, and for then a small number of people to relay the information to ministers. So chief science advisor, I think, and chief medical officer would be the people who are physically in the room with ministers, if at all. And I think that matters in terms of thinking about what would be the dynamics of this pressure. It wouldn't really come from SAGE, who I'm guessing if you spoke with most people on SAGE, they wouldn't feel that influential. I don't want to put words in your mouth there, but they would think, at most, I trust a senior colleague to relay this, what we've talked about. The other thing about being in the room, I think, given that we're talking about Scotland, is there's this assumption that there's this one audience for all this information. My impression is the main audience was the UK government ministers. Scottish government ministers were often not in that room, or they felt excluded from that process. So it's a different dynamic in terms of this question of who was putting pressure on who to do what. I think it's a different scenario with, say, the UK Prime Minister being ultimately responsible for these things, and then pressure on Scottish government ministers to either do their own thing or contribute to the UK's thing. And I think there's probably a lot of unpicking to do to work out where the pressure would come from. There probably was a pressure on Scottish government to do something, but it's a different kind of pressure in terms of what could it actually do, and what would that action look like? Is it to contribute to something bigger or to do something on its own? And then just the final thing on that, my impression is that if there was scientific pressure to do something, let me put that another way. If there was internal pressure to do something, it wasn't necessarily scientific pressure. My impression from pre-lockdown, which I'm happy to use confidently, because I suppose I would associate with the act of passing legislation to restrict social and business behaviour. That's what lockdown is to me. My impression is that this pressure did not really come from science advice, because the science advice was essentially the timing is critical. You don't want to act too early, and you don't want to act too late. And if you do things too early and too short, in a first wave of infection, there'll be a bigger second wave. You know, so I think the pressure to act wasn't necessarily coming from within in terms of providing this kind of dramatic report that said, okay, here's the new data, you've got to do something. I think that data was available weeks before the Minister did something anyway. You know, the 250,000 deaths, I think that was circulating for weeks. So I don't think that's where the pressure is coming from. I think it is, if anything, in terms of forecasting, the pressure came from, I think, a sense that an assumption about the forecasting proved to be wrong. And specifically, I think that was about the doubling time. I think there was a sense, a dramatic sense within government, that they had been making choices based on assessments that they then suddenly couldn't rely on. You know, essentially, this thing is much worse and much quicker than we expected, so we have to act dramatically given this new information. I think that if anything, if any impact of forecasting, it was that dramatic shift in their assumptions about what you know, reality looked like.
Thank you very much. Professor Busby, gentlemen, that's the time for our lunch break, so
Yep, we'll break now and we'll come back at 1:30. Thank you all very much.
All right.